The Holy Gospel according to John. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it's someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "Well, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes. Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities, for those authorities had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes? We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sin, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said to him, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. I remember hearing a few years ago when I lived in Lexington about a new student at the University of Kentucky who hailed from Kansas. And he had been invited by a new friend who lived in southeastern Kentucky to come home with him for a 3-day long weekend stay. Well, the sun was just setting as the two of them set out, and after they drove along for an hour or so, the one from Kansas commented that it sure looks like it's going to storm. "Why is that?" his friend asked. Well, I see all these dark clouds around me." To which the friend replied, "Those aren't clouds, my friends. Those are mountains." We're all conditioned to view the world in a particular way, sometimes by the parts of the country that we come from, like that story illustrates, but also by the family we grew up in, through our education, who we associate with, and a variety of other factors. In many ways, we're often blind to the ways that we are blind. I think maybe that's what Jesus was getting at when he says to some of the Pharisees at the end of that long gospel passage, "Now that you say we see, your sin remains." They couldn't admit and even begin to see their own blindness. During this Lenten season, some of you know I've been, and some of you have even been joining me to do a deeper dive into the Enneagram, which divides our human ways of perceiving and interacting with the world to 9 different kind of ways. It could be said that the Enneagram identifies 9 different versions of blindness. And I learned recently that the self-tests that one can take to determine one's Enneagram number are 60% inaccurate, which I think says more about how blind we are to our own compulsions than the reliability of those tests. Sometimes when people even learn a bit about the Enneagram and identify their primary habitual position, they ask, "Well, so what am I to do now to change?" And the answer is nothing. That's not the way it works. It more works like the healing and change comes simply through the seeing, no longer being blind. Enlightenment happens through seeing and that ego humiliation. And when we're no longer blind to the truth of our pattern compulsion and observe ourselves, well, we're doing it again, then we're less apt to get stuck in that rut. It can be quite freeing, quite healing. Once I was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. The Enneagram has also taught me that within one's shadow is also the light. Our gifts and our compulsions are totally intertwined. Well, there's much we can learn from this story of Jesus healing the man born blind from our gospel. We can reflect on our own spiritual blindness and how being a disciple of Jesus opens our eyes to see ourselves and others and our world in new ways. I'll go deeper with that aspect in a moment. But first, this blind man also gives us a lesson in testimony. When he was questioned for the second time by those Jewish authorities about Jesus, he simply tells his story. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. One doesn't have to be ready with all sorts of answers to complex theological questions. Testimony can simply be telling one's own story of healing and new life. So what's your story to tell? There's also embedded in this story John's commentary on the divisive split occurring near the end of the first century between Jewish Christians and those Jewish authorities who rejected their claim that Jesus was the Messiah and excommunicated and pushed them out. So the episode of Jesus coming to find the blind man after he was tossed out and rejected communicates Jesus' care for those that John was writing to who likewise had been rejected. The healing of this blind man through his washing in the pool of Siloam connects with all who have been washed in baptismal waters and are sent to bear God's light to the world. We too receive healing and new life in the waters of baptism. At the font, we receive the gift of faith. So that simple creed that we heard today on the lips of the one who was blind but now can see can become our creed as well. Did you catch it? It was only 3 words long, but it's the very reason why John says he writes this gospel. For when Jesus finds him and reveals his identity, the man simply responds, "Lord, I believe." Jesus not only gives us the eyes of faith to say, "Lord, I believe," he also gives us new eyes to see the suffering in our world and new hearts to respond with compassion. Once we see Jesus, we're no longer free to remain blind. Disciples of Jesus can't help but see what is right in front of our eyes: the hungry, the homeless, the displaced, the marginalized. We no longer have the luxury or the capacity to ignore anyone in need. We once were lost, but now are found. We're blind, but now we see. The need for all people to receive adequate health care, a living wage, food, and shelter. We see the needs for better support networks for those suffering from mental health issues. We no longer are blind to the scourge of gun violence and overdoses of fentanyl that plague our nation, often cutting short young lives. Jesus gives us eyes to welcome all those who feel rejected, displaced, alone. Saying, "Lord, I believe," isn't a declaration of our certainty, but rather an affirmation of our being a disciple and following our shepherd, Jesus. To say, "I believe," is trusting, it's surrender. To say, "I believe," is to enter into the fold, that mystical communion of all the saints in light. Jesus doesn't stop talking where the passage ended up. You were ready for it to sit down, I'm sure. It was a long passage. But he keeps talking at the very end of that passage and speaks of sheep who hear his voice and of being the gate and the good shepherd. The point being that the one who was healed of his blindness is now part of the fold. So saying, "I believe," includes our inviting Jesus to heal us of our blindness, to wake us up. Believing opens the door for our enlightenment, for our being a part of this larger community. Of Cordelia Burpee, the pastor of South Hero Congregational Church in Vermont, tells the story of how one person helped those serving at a community feeding program to see the folks in need that they were serving in new ways. Here's the story. Things were hectic as we got ready to open the church doors for the dinner crowd of homeless, hungry, marginally employed, and lonely people waiting outside. It was always a scramble to get enough help and to be ready on time. And sometimes the meals seemed just barely pulled together. But tonight was a good night. As people filled their plates and found places to sit, I noticed a tall, thin young man who was sitting on the edge of the stage and just watching everything with great interest. So I went over and introduced myself and sat down next to him. "You new here? I don't remember seeing you." He introduced himself as Philip and told me that he had tagged along with the Catholic Church ladies who had come with the dessert that night. I wanted to see how things worked here and if there's anything I could do to just help out. He mentioned that he had returned recently to town after a long absence and was getting adjusted. He looked worn out, but joked around and seemed happy to be with us. So I invited him to come back anytime to help or just to eat. He did return. He became involved in planning the meals. He replaced the paper placemats and napkins with white tablecloths and linen napkins, which he took home and washed and ironed each time. He set the tables carefully with fresh flowers that he convinced florists to donate. At the end of the meal, the vases of the flowers were offered to guests, so we scrounged more vases for the next meal. He greeted people at the door and escorted them to their table. To him, they were honored guests, and each meal was a celebration. He encouraged folks to share their stories. We celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and listened to updates on people's health, housing, and employment struggles. Eventually, Cornelia says, I heard Philip's story. He was HIV positive and had been struggling for 10 years to manage a variety of symptoms. He returned home because his symptoms were worsening. He had hoped to reconnect with his family, but the parents who had kicked out their gay teenage son still wanted no part of him. He was devastated and was casting around for some connection to his hometown. He decided to help others feel the welcome that he hadn't received. Philip kept those meals going during holidays and bad weather, sometimes all by himself because he never wanted anyone to show up and discover a locked door. In the process, he transformed those meals into a celebration of common connection. Each evening was full of laughter and joking as folks drifted from table to table to greet one another. I think Philip helped everyone involved with that feeding program to see in new ways. I imagine that he found healing from his own pain of rejection as the people who came shared their lives and stories. So in this way, he's like the healed man in our story who Jesus seeks out following his rejection from the synagogue. Philip shows us how to see others with the eyes of Christ, which is what follows our saying, Lord, I believe. Cordelia also shares that Philip says she shared that story, has since died. But she looks forward to the day when he'll greet her again and then escort her to her seat at another great banquet. This day, the healing waters of our baptism flow over us and through us. Our eyes have been opened to see one another, this whole world, and ourselves in new ways. This new way of seeing leads to a new way of living. For we once were lost, but now are found. We're blind, but now we see. We see how the light of the world continues to shine in and through us. Amen.